Hello, my name is Anna Granelli and I'm a Trade Policy Advisor at the National Board of Trade. My colleague Sara Sandelius and I are here to give you an introduction to the architecture of the multilateral trading system and the workings of the World Trade Organization. In our modern economy, products are increasingly made in the world, and international trade takes place within global or regional value chains. Input goods and services, people and data need to cross borders many times during the production and final consumption of a product or a service. Therefore, transparent and predictable rules for international trade are more important than ever, as well as having a global forum for dialogue and negotiations. The multilateral trading system consists of the rules, processes, and institutions established to govern and facilitate global trade. The main building block of this system is the World Trade Organization, the WTO.
In our introduction, we will go through the main features of the WTO. We will talk about the characteristics, the decision-making, organization, and objectives. We will briefly talk about its main functions, for example, the negotiation forum, implementation and monitoring of trade agreements, and the settlement of disputes between members. We will also explain the legal construction of the WTO and its basic principles, non-discrimination, transparency, predictability, and discuss the special treatment of developing countries. But first, I will say a few words about the history of the World Trade Organization. Before the WTO was established, multilateral trade was negotiated within the framework of GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was both a trade agreement and an organization. GATT was established in 1947. The trade negotiations within GATT were initially focusing only on trading goods and the reduction of tariffs. Eventually, other trade barriers were tackled, and there were attempts to improve the trading system. The negotiations that took place in the late 1980s and the early 90s led to a reform of international trade rules. The WTO and a new set of agreements was established in 1995, covering also trade in services and intellectual property rights. The WTO replaced GATT as an international organization, but the General Agreement still exists as the WTO's umbrella treaty for trading goods.
The WTO is an intergovernmental organization regulating trade between its members. The organization has over 160 members, representing about 4/5 of the world's independent states. Around 2/3 of the members are developing countries. Together, WTO members represent about 95% of world trade. But what characterizes the WTO? The WTO is a member-driven organization, meaning that the organization belongs to its members. The organization has a secretariat, led by the Director General, but it has more of a supportive and administrative function. All major decisions are made by the membership as a whole, either by ministers or by their ambassadors or delegates. Decisions are normally taken by consensus, and all member countries have one vote each. Consensus is considered to be reached as long as no member country blocks the matter concerned. Now, let's have a look at how the WTO is organized. Sara?
The WTO members make their decisions through various councils and committees, which consist of all WTO members. The highest decision-making body is the Ministerial Conference, which meets once every 2 years. The Ministerial Conference can make decisions on all matters under any of the multilateral trade agreements. The second level of the organization is the General Council, which manages the day-to-day work in between the Ministerial Conferences. The General Council works on behalf of the Ministerial Conference on all WTO affairs. The General Council also meets in the form of the Dispute Settlement Body, which oversees procedures for settling disputes between members, and the Trade Policy Review Body, which analyzes members' trade policies. The third level consists of councils for each broad area of trade: Goods Council, Services Council, and TRIPS Council, the Council for trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. There are also committees on different levels of the organization dealing with specific issues. So, what are the objectives of the WTO? Anna?
The WTO was established to govern and facilitate global trade. This is done by members agreeing on different rules and commitments liberalizing trade, such as substantial reductions of tariffs and other trade barriers, as well as elimination of discriminatory treatment in international trade. In the preamble of the WTO agreement, it is stated that one objective of the WTO is to expand the production of and trade in goods and services. It is, however, important to remember that international trade is not an objective in itself, but rather a tool to be used to achieve broader societal goals. The following objectives are also listed in the preamble to the WTO agreement: raise standards of living, ensure full employment, and a large and steadily growing volume of real income, while allowing for an optimal use of the world's resources with the objective of sustainable development. The fact that sustainable development is included as an explicit objective of the WTO means that sustainable development shall guide the interpretation of the covered agreements and trade rules. Also, the preamble emphasizes the need for differentiation between developed and developing countries, and special efforts to facilitate the integration of developing countries in the multilateral trading system. With these objectives in mind, the WTO aims at facilitating trade by removing trade barriers. However, there may be situations when other interests are more important than liberalizing trade. In some circumstances, the WTO rules therefore allow restrictions in trade. For example, measures that are necessary to protect human life or health or public morale may be permitted even if they are trade restrictive. In this way, the WTO members are allowed to balance between trade liberalization and other public values and interests.
So, what are the basic principles of the WTO? A number of fundamental principles run throughout all of the WTO agreements and are the foundation of the multilateral trading system. The principle of non-discrimination aims at securing equal treatment of products, services, and nationals. The principle has two parts. First of all, members shall not discriminate between their trading partners. This is called the most favored nation principle. It means that if a member grants an advantage to one member country, for example lowering a trade barrier, it has to give the same advantage to all members. Second of all, members are not allowed to discriminate between national and foreign products and services. This is called the national treatment principle. In other words, the national treatment principle prohibits a WTO member from treating domestic products more favorably than foreign products. It is important for WTO members and for traders to know which the global trade rules are, and that there will be no sudden changes of trade policy. The principles of transparency and predictability are therefore key in the multilateral trading system. WTO members are required to make available to the public all information on trade policies, fees, and required paperwork. Also, trading partners should be informed of and allowed to provide comments on proposals for new legislation that could affect trade. This information is provided in so-called notifications. Furthermore, when WTO members agree to open their markets for goods and services, they bind their commitments, and a member can only change its bindings after negotiating with its trading partners. Another important principle is the one of special treatment for developing countries. This is known as special and differential treatment. Special and differential treatment is the main instrument through which the WTO recognizes the different capacities of developed and developing countries. It is based on a recognition of the asymmetry and economic strength between WTO members, and also on a recognition that similar commitments cannot be expected of countries at different levels of development. The provisions on special and differential treatment are spread out across the WTO agreements and other legal instruments.
Looking at the content of the special and differential treatment provisions, one could say that there are basically four types of provisions granting special and differential treatment. First, there are provisions that give developing countries more favorable terms in the agreements, such as more flexibility in the use of certain policy instruments or lower level of commitments. In this category are also provisions aimed at increasing trading opportunities for developing countries. Secondly, there are provisions that give developing countries longer timeframes to implement commitments. These kinds of provisions were included in the majority of the WTO agreements. Most transitional periods have expired by now. However, some provisions provided possibility for extension. The third type of provisions are aimed at safeguarding the interests of developing countries. An example is that when member countries develop and implement technical regulations and standards, they shall take account of the special needs of developing country members. There are also a number of provisions that encourage members to provide technical assistance aimed at helping developing countries build their capacity to carry out WTO work. Such technical assistance may be given directly by developed country members or under the Technical Cooperation Programme of the WTO Secretariat. But what do we actually mean when we say developing countries? In general, there is no commonly accepted definition of developed and developing countries in the area of international trade. The same applies in the WTO. There are no formal definitions of developed and developing countries. Instead, members announce by themselves whether they are developed or developing. However, other members can challenge the decision of a member to make use of provisions available to developing countries. Within developing countries, there is a subgroup which is formally recognized and has a clear definition. This is the group of least developed countries. Here, the definition in the WTO follows the criteria of the United Nations. If a country is considered a least developed country by the United Nations, it will also be a least developed country in the WTO. Out of the total of 48 least developed countries in the world, over 30 are members of the WTO. Now, Sarah will tell you about the main functions of the WTO.
Firstly, the WTO is a forum for negotiation. The WTO agreements may be renegotiated, and new agreements can be added to the package. Negotiations within the WTO are conducted during so-called negotiation rounds, the period of time in which members meet and negotiate. During the GATT era, 8 negotiation rounds were conducted. The 8th round, the Uruguay round, which took place between 1986 and 1994, was the most comprehensive round and led to the creation of the WTO and the WTO agreements as we know them today. Over time, the negotiation rounds have become more complex as they involve a growing number of countries and a broader range of issues. Because of this, the negotiation rounds have taken more and more time to conclude. Secondly, the WTO administers 2 important enforcement mechanisms, which are central elements in providing security and predictability to the multilateral trading system. One of these is the dispute settlement system, which is a forum where members can bring disputes if they think their rights under the agreements are being infringed. The aim is to preserve the rights and obligations of members under the covered agreements and to clarify the provisions of these agreements. The dispute settlement system is often referred to as one of WTO's prime achievements. During the first 20 years of WTO, 500 disputes have been handled and around 63% of the WTO membership had used the system. The aim is to find a solution mutually acceptable for both parties of a dispute. The compliance rate within the dispute settlement rulings is therefore very high, around 90%. The other enforcement mechanism handled by the WTO is the trade policy review mechanism, in which the WTO is reviewing the members' national trade policies. The reviews aim at monitoring the implementation of the WTO trade rules and the consistency between WTO rules and national trade policies. The reviews not only take into account members' trade policies and practices, but also the external economic environment that they face. This means that the reviews also focus on aspects not regulated by the WTO, but may have implications on trade. As we talked about earlier, helping developing countries to participate more fully in the global trading system is one of the objectives of the WTO. Therefore, an important function of the WTO is to provide technical assistance and capacity building. Technical assistance by the WTO is mainly provided in the form of training and aims at helping government officials from beneficiary countries better understand WTO rules so that they can better exercise their rights of membership, negotiate effectively with their trading partners, and implement obligations. In cooperation with other organizations and member countries, the WTO also participates in other types of capacity building. For example, the WTO is a core partner in the Enhanced Integrated Framework, which aims at supporting the efforts of least developed countries to mainstream trade into national development strategies and build a capacity to trade. The WTO also acts as the main coordinator of the Aid for Trade initiative, which encourages developing country governments and donors to recognize the role that trade can play in development. In particular, the initiative seeks to mobilize resources to address the trade-related constraints, including supply-side constraints identified by developing and the least developed countries. Dialogue with different stakeholders and the media is another important function of the WTO in order to enhance cooperation and increase awareness of the organization. Last but not least, one of the main functions of the WTO is to facilitate the implementation, administration, and operation of the multilateral trade agreements.
The rules in these agreements are the core of the organization and provide the legal ground rules for international trade. Essentially, the rules are contracts binding the WTO members to keep their trade policies within agreed limits. The legal system of the WTO includes a large number of different trade agreements. The system is based on the concept of single undertaking, which means that almost all agreements are binding upon all members as one single body of law. This is achieved by annexing all agreements to one single agreement, namely the Wto Agreement. The Wto Agreement is therefore an umbrella agreement containing the other 4 agreements in 4 annexes.
Annex 1 contains the substantive trade rules, the mandatory multilateral agreements. It is divided into 3 parts: trade in goods, trade in services, and trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. These 3 parts are also called the 3 pillars of the WTO and are the core of the substantive multilateral trade rules. The GATT pillar covers the agreements covering trade in goods. The GATS pillar, the agreements covering trade in services, and the TRIPS pillar contain the rules on intellectual property rights. GATT and GATS are also complemented with commitments made by each WTO member. The specific commitments are listed in documents called Schedules of Concessions, which reflect specific tariff concessions and other commitments given by the members. For trade in goods, these usually consist of maximum tariff levels, which are often referred to as bound tariffs or bindings. For services, the schedules consist of commitments for market access or limitation of market access. Annex 2 of the WTO agreement contains the dispute settlement rules, and Annex 3 establishes the trade policy review mechanism. These 3 annexes are binding upon all members. The 4th annex contains the agreements that are optional and therefore only binding on those members who have chosen to be covered by the agreements. These agreements are called plurilateral and not multilateral, since they only involve some members. Plurilateral solutions may be a possibility when there's not enough support among the WTO members to engage multilaterally. For example, when only a limited group of members have an interest of liberalizing trade in a certain sector. Plurilateral solutions within the WTO framework may take different forms, but must all relate to the basic principle of most favored nation, the foundation of the multilateral trading system. One option is to include the agreements in Annex 4 of the WTO agreement. In order to do so, consensus among the WTO members is needed. However, these agreements do not create any rights and obligations for the WTO members who have not signed the agreements. In other words, the agreements of Annex 4 of the WTO agreement are not applied on a most favored nation basis. This means that only the WTO members who have signed the agreements are obliged to liberalize the markets covered by the agreements, and consequently, only those members benefit from the liberalizations. Members can also choose to negotiate plurilaterally outside the WTO and then include the commitments made in the schedules of concessions. In this way, also WTO members who have not signed the agreements still enjoy the benefits of the agreements. This means that these kind of agreements are applied on a most favored nation basis.
Another way of engaging only a few WTO members is to negotiate bilateral or regional trade agreements. These agreements are negotiated and applied outside the framework of the WTO. The parties of such agreements give each other benefits not given to other WTO members, which is normally not allowed in the WTO due to the most favored nation principle. Therefore, bilateral or regional trade agreements need to be exempted from this principle. This requires fulfilling certain conditions. For example, the agreements must not lead to the impairment of the benefits of the WTO members not being part of the agreement. For bilateral and regional trade agreements between developing countries, the conditions that need to be fulfilled are less strict. There may also be situations when developed countries wish to give tariff preferences to developing or least developed countries, in accordance with the principle of special and differential treatment. Such unilateral preference schemes are exempted from the most favored nation principle under the so-called enabling clause. The coverage and preconditions of such preference schemes are decided by the preference-giving countries, and it should be noted that being considered a developing country in the WTO does not guarantee receiving preferences.
So, international trade is a tool to be used in order to raise the standards of living, ensure employment and grow volume of income, in accordance with the objective of sustainable development. This is stated in the Wto Agreement. The WTO aims at creating a trade-friendly environment for business through the principles of transparency and predictability. It allows for all its members to participate in the multilateral trading system on equal conditions through the fundamental principle of non-discrimination, while at the same time taking into account the different levels of development of the members. Also, it makes the trade rules more effective by enforcing the rules through the dispute settlement system. The WTO, therefore, has an important role to play in the global economy.
A lot has changed since the WTO was established in 1995. For example, the patterns of international trade have become increasingly complex, and the regulatory area that is considered to be relevant to international trade is more comprehensive. At the same time, membership of the WTO has expanded and become more diverse. This has proven to be challenging for the WTO, in particular for the negotiation function. The WTO must keep up with these changes and find a way to align the multilateral trade rules with the new trade reality. However, the WTO belongs to its members and is dependent on their will to push the organization forward. Therefore, how the WTO will handle the new trade reality, further eliminate discrimination in international trade, and make the multilateral trading system supportive of sustainable development is up to the members.